I was just about to step into my brand new backyard oasis for the first time, my big toe hovering over the shimmering turquoise water, when I noticed a piece of paper taped to my patio door. The words "Final Warning" in all caps were impossible to miss, printed in harsh black ink. My stomach twisted. I'd only moved into this house a few weeks ago, still juggling boxes and paint swatches, yet somehow I'd already earned the ire of what appeared to be the local homeowners association. The trouble was, I was never part of their HOA in the first place. It was a sizzling afternoon in early June. Earlier that week, I'd paid a pool service to clean and chlorinate the water, double-checking everything was safe for a dip. Owning a pool was one of the main reasons I'd bought this property. I'd spent years dreaming of lazy days under the sun, poolside get-togethers with friends, and maybe even the occasional grandkid visit in the future. Yet here I stood, reading a letter that threatened me with significant fines if I dared to swim in my own yard. The letter read, "You are in direct violation of the Maplewood Park Homeowners Association regulations regarding recreational water features. Cease all use of the pool immediately. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines and possible legal action." I let out a disbelieving laugh. I thought maybe it was some scam or a leftover piece of junk mail. But the letter was dated yesterday, signed by Marjorie Davis, HOA president. I wasn't new to the concept of HOAs. My sister once lived in a neighborhood with hyper-strict regulations, where residents were fined if their porch lights weren't a specific wattage. But as far as I knew when I bought this house, I was assured by the realtor that the previous owners had opted out of the Maplewood Park HOA years ago. The property, with its unique boundary lines, sat just outside the main community's official membership. I never signed a single HOA covenant, never agreed to pay their fees or follow their rules. I threw on a pair of sandals and marched over to the nearest neighbor's house, letter in hand. I rapped on the door, adrenaline still surging. A tall, lanky man in a wrinkled button-down answered. I explained my situation, quickly realizing he was the new occupant just like me. He'd only been there a month. He shrugged apologetically, saying he had, in fact, joined the HOA but knew almost nothing about it yet. He seemed embarrassed, and after a bit of small talk, I saw he was equally annoyed by the HOA's intrusiveness. I headed back to my own property, stepping around an obstacle course of half-unpacked boxes in the garage. Before I could finish reading the letter's fine print, my phone buzzed. It was Marjorie Davis herself, calling from a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, then picked up. She introduced herself in a clipped, authoritative tone. "This is the Maplewood Park HOA president. Have you received our notice?" "Yes, I have. But I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," I said, trying to keep my cool. "My property isn't under your HOA. The previous owner opted out, so..." She cut me off. "That's not how it works, Mr. Chambers. Our records show your pool was constructed prior to your alleged opt-out. All improvements remain subject to HOA guidelines. We have the authority to regulate it. I'm sorry, but from the legal documents I have, the previous owner formally withdrew from Maplewood Park, and the property was never rejoined." She made a condescending little hum. "Well, the board believes otherwise. We've been in place for over 20 years, and we have robust compliance protocols. I suggest you review them." I felt my frustration spike. "I've reviewed my purchase agreement, and it states clearly that I am not." "That will be all, Mr. Chambers," she interrupted. "Have a nice day." The call ended with a click. The gall of that woman. My first impulse was to storm over to the HOA office, wherever it was, and thrust my paperwork in her face, demanding an apology. But I decided to gather more information first, to avoid a messy confrontation fueled by half-truths. Later that day, I rummaged through my closing documents, the property survey, and the title packet from the realtor. Sure enough, there was a special note about the opt-out agreement, signed 10 years ago by the previous owner, Mark Petrie. The local county clerk's stamp was on it, which made it official. The contract spelled out that Maplewood Park HOA no longer held any claim or authority over the property, including additions or improvements. Yes, the pool. My stomach knotted as I realized the extent of their audacity. They were either misinformed or willfully ignoring official county records. As evening fell, I decided to run a quick errand and pick up groceries. When I returned, I found yet another notice, this time pinned to the wooden post near my side gate. It had the same urgent, ominous tone, second warning. They were threatening me with an immediate fine of $300 if I didn't comply within 48 hours. It was borderline harassment, especially since I'd never been a member of their organization. Exhausted and annoyed, I took a moment to collect myself. I reminded myself that anger could lead to mistakes. My next step had to be methodical. If they insisted on playing hardball, I needed to respond with proper legal clarity. And for that, I need a lawyer or at least some official guidance from the county. One thing was clear. If the Maplewood Park HOA thought they could bully me into submission, they had no idea who they were dealing with. I locked up the house and walked out to the edge of the pool. The moonlight glimmered across the still water, casting dancing shadows on the concrete. I ran my fingers through the air just above the surface, imagining the coolness I'd been denied by that ridiculous letter. My frustration grew. Let them bring their threats. I wasn't about to give up the very reason I chose this home in the first place. By the next morning, I had the county records office on the phone. A polite staffer named Brenda confirmed that my property was, indeed, not under the jurisdiction of Maplewood Park HOA. "Do you have a copy of the legal opt-out agreement in front of you?" Brenda asked. When I said I did, she walked me through the language line by line. By the time we hung up, she'd assured me that the county recognized my property's independence. Any claims by the HOA that I was in violation of their rules were flatly invalid. Armed with that confirmation, I decided to pay a visit to Maplewood Park's management building. It was a surprisingly modest office in a small brick strip mall, just down the road from a nail salon and a bakery. The door was locked when I first arrived, so I pressed a buzzer. A middle-aged woman with stylish glasses answered and introduced herself as Betty, the HOA's secretary. I explained the reason for my visit. "I've received 2 warnings about my pool, but I have documents clearly stating that my home isn't part of this HOA." Betty's eyes widened. "Oh dear, let me see if Marjorie is available." A moment later, I found myself in a cramped conference room that had a long table, mismatched chairs, and a single potted fern drooping in the corner. Marjorie Davis sat at the far end, arms folded. She wore a meticulously pressed suit, her graying hair pulled into a stern bun. She looked as if she'd been preparing for battle. I slid my papers across the table. "Here are the county records, along with the original opt-out agreement. The property has been excluded from Maplewood Park for over a decade." Marjorie barely glanced at them. "I appreciate your diligence, Mr. Chambers, but we have the original Maplewood Park covenants and restrictions. In them, it states that any subsequent owners must adhere to the guidelines if the property lies within the geographical boundary. As far as the board is concerned, the prior owner's opt-out is null and void." I clenched my jaw. That's not how it works. The county itself has recognized this agreement. You can't just override legal documents because you don't like them. Betty shifted uncomfortably, as though not entirely comfortable with her boss's stance. But Marjorie pressed on. "You're free to consult a lawyer, of course. Meanwhile, you are not permitted to use your pool until we've resolved this dispute. It's a health and safety issue." "A health and safety issue?" I said, incredulous. "It was just inspected by the same pool service you've recommended to other HOA members." She tilted her chin in that exasperatingly smug way. "We have guidelines about proper fencing, signage, even water usage. Your property fails to meet those. So until you do, you can't use the pool. If we see you doing so, we'll impose fines." I stared at her, my blood boiling. "With all due respect, I'll see you in court if I have to. You have no right to fine me, and your refusal to accept a county-stamped document isn't my problem." Marjorie only responded with a tight smile. "Have a nice day, Mr. Chambers." I left the office and slumped into my car, frustration coursing through me. Nothing about this was fair. Technically, yes, I could ignore them, but the last thing I wanted was a barrage of threatening letters or a surprise lien attempt, even if it wasn't valid. Plus, my new neighbors might catch wind of the drama and think I was the neighborhood menace. Not the ideal way to settle into a new community. That afternoon, while returning home, I spotted an older gentleman slowly walking his dog. He had me kindly, so I waved. He introduced himself as Fred, an 11-year resident of Maplewood Park. I decided to ask him about the HOA. Fred sighed, pausing with his golden retriever in tow. Marjorie's been in charge for 3 years, and she's run it like some personal kingdom. A lot of us are tired of it. He frowned at the mention of my pool. Ah, yes, your house was the talk of the neighborhood when the previous owner dropped out of the HOA. Some folks said it set a bad precedent. Others admired him for standing up for his rights. So you knew Mark Petrie? He nodded. He was an amicable guy. Didn't like being told he couldn't paint his mailbox black instead of the official brown. Next thing we knew, he found a loophole and left the HOA altogether. Marjorie's still sore about that. If she's giving you trouble, it's probably because she wants to make an example out of you. That conversation gave me clarity. It wasn't merely about health and safety. It was personal. Marjorie Davis was determined to reassert her authority after Mark Petrie's rebellion. And now, as the new owner, I was her next target. Fueled by righteous indignation, I contacted a local attorney recommended by my realtor, Rebecca Nguyen. Over the phone, she listened attentively, occasionally murmuring in disbelief. Unfortunately, HOAs can be aggressive, she said. But if you have a legally binding opt-out, they can't just ignore it. I'll look into the local statutes to confirm. Meanwhile, keep meticulous records of any communications from them. I followed her advice. Over the next few days, the HOA's letters kept coming, each more menacing than the last. Fines started at $300, then escalated to $500. At one point, they demanded access to my backyard for an HOA inspection, threatening that refusal would be seen as an admission of guilt. I refused, of course. I snapped pictures of the letters, forwarded them to Rebecca, and waited. In the meantime, I tried to go about my daily life, unpacking boxes, painting walls, hooking up the washer and dryer. But every time I glanced out the window at that gorgeous pool, and used, shimmering under the sun, I felt a pang of resentment. I was paying for pool upkeep, paying for the water, and paying in stress. For a resource I had every right to use. On the 5th morning of this madness, I woke up to a bizarre sight, a large warning, private property, NO swimming allowed sign planted in my front yard. The HOA logo was slapped on the bottom corner. Neighbors ambled by, offering sympathetic looks and shaking their heads. That was the moment I decided enough was enough. I dragged the sign out of the ground, tossed it in my garage, and called Rebecca. We're going to fight this, I told her firmly. However we need to, let's get it done. She sounded confident. Absolutely. We'll get a restraining order if they keep trespassing or harassing you. I'll be in touch with the HOA's counsel to set them straight. They can't keep this up forever. Hanging up, I felt a renewed sense of determination. Marjorie wanted a fight, and though I'd prefer a peaceful resolution, I wasn't about to let her trample over my rights. The real question was how far she was willing to go, and whether the rest of the HOA would support her or eventually turn against her authoritarian tactics. A week later, things took a surprising turn. Attorney Rebecca called to inform me that Maplewood Park HOA had hired their own legal counsel, someone named Anthony Collins, known in town for representing large associations and property developers. But even more surprising, he reached out to Rebecca, claiming that the HOA wanted to resolve the conflict amicably. I breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, maybe they saw reason. Maybe once Collins reviewed the opt-out agreement, he'd convince Marjorie to back down, saving everyone time and money. We set a meeting for a Tuesday afternoon at Rebecca's office, a small but tidy space in a renovated old house near the courthouse. When I arrived, Marjorie was there, arms crossed, a scowl etched into her face. Collins sat beside her, impeccably dressed in a navy suit, thick binder in front of him. The moment we all settled, Collins cleared his throat. "Let's get to the heart of the matter," he began. "Mr. Chambers, the HOA maintains that your property is within their boundaries. They believe the prior opt-out was improperly executed." He paused, flipping through papers. "However, it appears the county recognized the document as valid." I nodded. "Which means it is valid, Mr. Collins. The stamps and signatures are official." Marjorie bristled. "That's up for debate. Mistakes happen, and the board contends that Mark Petrie never followed the correct procedure to exit the HOA. Rebecca interjected smoothly. We have a record from the county that says otherwise. Mr. Chambers is fully within his rights to use his pool and do anything else he wants on his property without Maplewood Park's oversight. Collins tapped a pen against his binder. I see. However, we do have to consider the original covenants and restrictions from when Maplewood Park was established. That document predates the opt-out by over a decade and might carry legal weight if it was never officially amended. I suppressed a groan. This was exactly the sort of legal murkiness the HOA was likely banking on. They were hoping to cling to some archaic language that might overshadow a properly executed agreement. Rebecca shook her head. A covenant can't override a later, legally processed agreement to release the property from the association. Moreover, we have precedents in this county. Several other properties have left HOAs under similar conditions. They aren't retroactively forced back in. Marjorie was practically grinding her teeth by now. Mr. Chambers' pool is an eyesore, she spat. He doesn't maintain the landscaping around it in accordance with our standards. I stared at her, stunned. An eyesore? It's brand new plaster with well-trimmed hedges. Maybe you should look at the plenty of weed-filled gardens in the actual Maplewood Park membership before you call my property an eyesore. Collins raised a hand, urging calm. Let's keep personal feelings aside. Here's an offer. The HOA is willing to waive any and all fines if Mr. Chambers agrees to rejoin the association voluntarily, beginning this season. Then he could request any approvals needed for the pool or other improvements. I almost laughed. Why on earth would I do that? I'd be volunteering to pay fees and be subject to rules I never agreed with, especially after this harassment. No, thank you. Marjorie's face hardened. Collins looked pained. We can negotiate the HOA dues. Maybe reduce them for the first year. Rebecca leaned in, voice resolute. Mr. Chambers doesn't have to rejoin. That's non-negotiable. We're here to finalize the recognition that Maplewood Park has zero authority over his property. End of story. For a moment, the tension in the room was so thick you could feel the crackle in the air. Finally, Collins sighed. All right, given the documentation, I'll have to advise the board to consider withdrawing its claims. I'll also need time to review the county records in detail. Rebecca nodded. Take all the time you need. But meanwhile, the harassment stops. No more letters, no more trespassing, no more signage on Mr. Chambers' property. She slid a typed letter across the table, a firm but polite cease and desist. We have no desire to escalate, but we will if necessary. Marjorie leaned back, arms still crossed, giving me a venomous glare. I can't believe Mark Petrie pulled this stunt. Now we have to deal with you. I met her gaze, refusing to be intimidated. I'm just a homeowner who wants to enjoy his home. That's all. With that, the meeting ended. I left feeling cautiously optimistic. Collins seemed far more rational than Marjorie. I hoped he'd be able to convince her to quit her crusade before it blew up in the HOA's face. Perhaps I could finally open that box of pool floats in my garage and actually use them. For the next 2 weeks, I received no new threats or letters, which felt like a victory in itself. Though I was wary of letting my guard down too soon, I allowed a smidgen of hope to creep in. One sunny Saturday, I decided to bite the bullet and hold my first backyard barbecue. I invited a few friends from my old neighborhood, plus my sister and her husband. I figured that if the HOA was backing off, I might as well enjoy my pool as planned. It was a gorgeous day. We grilled burgers, sipped lemonade, and laughed as we floated around on inflatable chairs in the pool. For a blissful few hours, I forgot all about Maplewood Park's meddling. I didn't see any sign of prying eyes over the fence, nor did any uniformed official show up to ruin the fun. It was exactly the day I'd envisioned back when I first decided to buy a home with a pool. But peace never lasts when you're dealing with someone like Marjorie Davis. On Monday morning, I opened my mailbox to find a certified letter from an entity called Evergreen County Mediation Services. Inside was a brief note stating that Maplewood Park HOA was requesting a formal mediation session to resolve a boundary dispute and covenant enforcement matter. Boundary dispute? They'd never mentioned that before. Of course, I was suspicious. More than likely, this was a new angle, a last-ditch attempt to force me into compliance. Maybe they claimed the fence around the pool encroached on HOA land or something equally absurd. I called Rebecca in a huff, who calmly explained that attending the mediation wouldn't hurt, if only to show we were willing to be cooperative. So I resigned myself to yet another round of pointless negotiations. Meanwhile, curiosity got the better of me, and I started chatting with more neighbors about the situation. Several longtime residents revealed that Marjorie's approach to power was often heavy-handed, but rarely challenged. Fred, the dog walker, said that in the last HOA election, no one even ran against her, so she won by default. I was starting to suspect that part of her vendetta against me was fueled by fear. Fear that if others saw a homeowner living next to Maplewood Park with zero HOA obligations, they might try to follow suit. Perhaps that explained her desperation. If I could show everyone that it was perfectly feasible to live near Maplewood Park but not be bound by it, maybe she'd lose her iron grip. That revelation gave me an odd sort of resolve. I wasn't just fighting for my own right to use my pool. I might be paving the way for future homeowners who wanted to escape the stifling rules. Even if that wasn't my original mission, it felt good to stand up for the principle. So yes, I agreed to the mediation. But I told Rebecca plainly, I'm not giving an inch of my land or my autonomy. This is my property, my pool, and my life. She gave me a small, confident smile. And you've got every legal right to it. Let's remind them of that. The mediation session took place in a nondescript county office building. Stark fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the stale smell of old carpet filled the air. A neutral mediator, Ms. Phyllis Caldwell, welcomed us with a warm smile and a calm demeanor. We sat around a large circular table, Rebecca and I on one side, Marjorie, Anthony Collins, and a newly introduced HOA board member, Harlan Smith, on the other. Ms. Caldwell began with a soothing voice. Mediation is a chance to communicate openly, find common ground, and avoid litigation if possible. Let's start by hearing Maplewood Park's concerns. Marjorie dove right in. The property in question was originally part of the Maplewood Park development. It was never properly removed from our HOA. The homeowner has a swimming pool that violates our guidelines on fencing height, child safety locks, and community aesthetics. I suppressed an eye roll. Here we go again. Colin stayed silent, presumably letting Marjorie do the talking this time. Ms. Caldwell turned to us. How do you respond, Mr. Chambers? Rebecca cleared her throat politely. We have incontrovertible proof, documents filed with the county clerk over 10 years ago, that Mr. Chambers' property is excluded from Maplewood Park's membership. As such, he's not obligated to follow the HOA's guidelines. The pool was built legally and recently passed inspection by a licensed pool service. There's no ongoing safety concern, and the county has not mandated any changes. If Maplewood Park's guidelines no longer apply, there is no violation. Marjorie leaned forward, her eyes flashing. But the prior owner's so-called opt-out was never approved by our board. The county might have made a clerical error. We want Mr. Chambers to meet the HOA halfway, join voluntarily, comply with the safety and aesthetic rules, and we'll waive the backlog of fines. I could feel my frustration rising again, but I kept my voice steady. I've already said I won't rejoin an association I never wanted to be part of. We are not subject to your fees, fines, or rules. Harlan, the new board member, spoke up for the first time. He seemed more level-headed than Marjorie. If I may, the board acknowledges that the county recognized this opt-out, but the board was never consulted. If it's truly valid, so be it. But if it's not, we could face a messy court battle. Collins cleared his throat. We've reviewed the documents. While it's unusual, it does appear the county accepted the opt-out as legitimate. Absent any contradictory evidence, we don't have a strong case to force Mr. Chambers back into the HOA. I nearly exhaled in relief. At last, reason from their side. Marjorie, however, was not pleased. She shot Collins an incredulous look, then turned her scorn on Harlan. Are we just going to roll over? This sets a precedent. Other homeowners will try to leave if they see there's no consequence for ignoring the covenants. I resisted the urge to point out that no one was ignoring anything. I simply had a legal arrangement that predated my ownership. But Ms. Caldwell intervened, voice calm but firm. President Davis, the point of this mediation is to see if an agreement can be reached. If the county recognizes the property's opt-out, your association must abide by the law. A tense silence settled over the room. Finally, Collins sighed. We propose a compromise. Maplewood Park will drop all fines and claims if Mr. Chambers ensures that his pool adheres to county safety codes, like having a secure fence and child-proof locks on gates. These are standard requirements anyway, beyond HOA rules. In return, the HOA will acknowledge that he is not a member and will cease all attempts to collect dues or enforce covenants. Rebecca glanced my way. I nodded, grateful. This was precisely what I'd been doing from the start, complying with actual county regulations. My fence was already the required height, and my gates had safety latches. That was my responsibility as a homeowner, not because of any HOA. That's acceptable, Rebecca answered. Mr. Chambers never objected to standard safety codes, only to the HOA's overreach. If Maplewood Park signs a legal document affirming that he's exempt from membership and no further fines will be pursued, we'll gladly sign it and end this matter. A moment passed while Marjorie's jaw tightened. She seemed on the brink of another protest, but Collins placed a gentle hand on her arm. Madam President, he said quietly, this is likely the best resolution. We risk a costly lawsuit otherwise. She let out a bitter sigh. Fine. The word escaped her lips as though it physically pained her. An hour later, after Ms. Caldwell drafted the basics of our agreement, we all signed. It felt surreal. After so much back-and-forth harassment, a few signatures and handshakes had finally secured my right to swim in my own pool without fear. That said, I could see the fury simmering in Marjorie's eyes. I doubted I'd ever get a friendly wave from her if we passed on the street, but I'd gladly live without her approval. The next morning was unseasonably warm, with the sun already blazing by 9 o'clock. Determined to savor my victory, I slipped on a swimsuit, grabbed a towel, and headed out to my pool. There was no ominous sign pinned to my fence, no unsolicited letters stuffed in the mailbox. Just me, my backyard, and the sparkling water. I eased in slowly, letting the coolness wash over me. It felt like reclaiming a piece of my life that had been locked away. Over the following weeks, the tension in the neighborhood began to thaw. Harlan and a couple of other board members actually stopped by to introduce themselves in a neighborly fashion. They apologized for how things escalated. Apparently, Marjorie had been pushing them into a corner for years, making them believe they had no choice but to go along with her demands. Now that Collins confirmed I really was out of their jurisdiction, they saw no reason for continued conflict. That's not to say Marjorie waved the white flag publicly. She stayed aloof, rarely making eye contact if she happened to drive by. But I noticed fewer of her ominous declarations in the community newsletters. Neighbors told me she'd lost a good deal of credibility after the fiasco, especially since some residents discovered that the HOA funds had been used, in part, to pay Collins for the nearly baseless fight against me. Several people were outraged. A few even talked about calling for a new election. In the end, I like to think I helped the neighborhood by standing up to her. I couldn't speak for every Maplewood Park resident, but the ones I met seemed relieved that someone had finally challenged their president's overreach. As for me, I got to enjoy the freedom I'd rightfully bought with my home, the same freedom Mark Petrie fought for years ago. Sometimes, late in the evening, I float on my back in the pool and stare up at the stars. I think about how petty bureaucracy can stir up storms where none should exist. I also think about how quickly someone in a position of authority can turn that authority into a weapon rather than a tool for good. But mostly, I'm just grateful. Grateful that I stood my ground, grateful for the county clerk's stamp on that opt-out agreement, and grateful for a neighborhood that, Marjorie aside, isn't half bad. Because that's the truth. No matter how frustrating an HOA or certain individuals might be, communities are made up of people. And most people, given a fair look at the facts, will choose decency over pettiness. In my case, decency prevailed. I still pass Fred walking his golden retriever, and we give each other friendly waves. When a man next door grills on weekends, I get a warm hello over the fence. That's what neighborhood life should be. Simple gestures of goodwill, not a cycle of fear and punishment. So yes, my pool is open for business. And no, the Maplewood Park HOA can't say a thing about it. If that's not a satisfying ending, I don't know what is. The end.